Uh, Thank you so much for helping my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sammia Elbakry, and I'm a recent graduate from the Leiden University with the LLM in Air and Space Law. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but within the realm of space law, it's quite a famous study. And I stumbled upon space law maybe in 2013 by accident. Like I overheard two people talking about it, and I was like, "What is that?" And since then, I've been kind of obsessed with it, and finally in 2020 made the decision to specialize. And I was lucky because I'm from the Netherlands, and the university is in the Netherlands, so I didn't really have a lot of obstacles to get there. But I was also the only Dutch student. Like the rest of the students came from all over the world, so that was a really nice international experience. Um, and currently, I'm teaching at the Free University of Amsterdam at the law faculty, not really in space law courses, but every minute I don't have to spend on education, I can spend on research, and that is in my specialization in space law.
So when you overheard about space law, what attracted you to it? Was there anything specific?
Yeah, honestly, two things that I've come to realize later on. But first of all, is I don't really like law because it deals with a lot of problems and most importantly, people's problems. It's quite heavy, especially things like criminal law or private law, like divorces and things like that. So I was a law student that wasn't really into law, and I was kind of looking at ways to get out of the classic law professions. And I've really all my life liked space, but I'm not very good at math or physics. And when I overheard these people talking about space, I was like, whoa, that might be, an opportunity for me to get to do something with law, but about a subject that I'm really interested in without having to have that beta background. So yeah.
And that's really exciting. Do you have an idea on kind of, who your clients will be and the type of work that you would do?
Well, you can go a lot of ways. I'm very much interested in academics because I'm very much interested in the ethical questions that come with our space activities because there has been a lot happening, but at the same time, there's a lot that still has to have happen. And that well brings forth a lot of ethical questions, and that's more suited for academics. But you could also work with startups, for example, advise them how they can well conduct responsible space behavior, for example. How does it work with national laws? Because a lot of countries don't have national space law yet, and international space law is quite limited, and is not foreseen for the commercial sector at all. Whereas all these startups are pursuing space activities with commercial purposes in mind. So you could always work in that sector as well, and you could be an advisor, of course, for governments.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That sounds really exciting. And I can see how that's a really different thing than like a normal law career would have been and why you might like it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I wanted to ask you about the Artemis Accords, but before getting there, I wanted to uh, ask you my normal set of questions.
Sure.
So I guess, first of all, did you know that NASA is planning to send astronauts back to the moon?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
How did you find out about it?
Well, I have to say, I'm very much interested in all these ethical questions, but I'm not the person that has all the launches on live stream, so I'm not that much into like the technical developments. But I've heard about it through my research, through my education, and being surrounded by people who do watch all these live streams. So that's how I came to know that NASA had the Artemis program and is planning to put people on the moon again.
And do you know approximately what year you found out about it?
I think it was 2021
Hmm.
that I heard about it. Yeah,
Most of the people I talk to have no idea that we're going back to the moon. Of course, most of them aren't space warriors either, so
yeah,
there's that.
yeah. Yeah, well, that's true. I have to say, like everything I don't know, I get to hear from people around me. Like it's a really a small world, and you'll get information if you didn't ask for it. So yeah,
And so what do you think about going back to the moon, about the Artemis project?
I think it's great. Actually, it's I think it sort of confronts us again with our place in the universe as humans. And well, we have all these sci-fi movies about being able to go into space and come back and having this interaction with this whole realm that surround us, when in reality we're not there yet. And I think the fact that NASA will be able to put people on the moon again sort of brings us a step closer to that future image that we all the time look at. So yeah.
And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that future. So if you think way out in the future, like 200 years from now,
Mhm.
what does that look like to you? Like, what does humanity look like in 200 years in 22, 23?
Humanity as a whole, like our development as humankind on Earth, or you mean like in space, or both, or what are you aiming at?
Yeah, well, I just in general, but I guess one basic question. So we could kind of refine that to some maybe some easier questions to contemplate. Do you
Yeah.
think we're still only on the Earth, or do you think we have people living on the moon and Mars and other places?
I think we might. I'm not sure how and when we can make this a sustainable permanent settlement. So I'm not sure if we're going to be there in 200 or 300 years, but if we're not yet, then we're almost there. I'm sure of it because we already have people in space, you know, the International Space Station. So it's a smaller step to get people on the moon, to get permanent settlement on the moon. I know there's a lot of development in space agriculture. I don't know if you've heard of the University of Wageningen. It's also here in the Netherlands, but
Mhm.
they do a lot of research on simulating the conditions of space and trying to get agriculture happening. And I mean, like if these all these projects succeed, then we have a large chance that indeed in 200 years we're able to get permanent settlements. And I'm not saying it is accessible for everyone yet, but I'm sure we're able to do it. So
That is really exciting. A few other questions about the future in 200 years. Do you
yeah,
think there's more people, less people, or the same number of people?
not sure. There's I think it can go both ways. And you mean like population numbers, right?
Yeah.
I think it can go both ways. I think if people live longer, they're less inclined to have children earlier on. And I mean, like in the past, having a lot of children was also kind of a security system for your well-being when you age. And I think that's being replaced by social systems within countries. So I'm not sure how birth rate will go, and I'm not sure how death rate will go. So it to me it can go both ways, honestly.
Do you think there's more countries, the same number of countries, or fewer countries in 200 years?
I think not sure. It also depends whether or not we can create countries in space. Uh,
Hmm.
because if we can, then you know we might have more countries later on. And it also kind of depends, you know, if well existing countries have parts that want to separate and get their own sovereignty, then you know you can have more countries. But I think that's not an easy process. So it's not like, oh, we'll have you know 50 countries more than we have currently or something like that.
How about languages?
The language is ever evolving, I think. And that's also part of my background. I also studied Arabic language and culture, and I'm very much interested in languages. And even with studying Arabic, you know, there are so many countries that speak Arabic, but within those countries, you have so many dialects. And one of my lecturers at this study, she said like a language is basically a dialect with an army. It's just the prevailing dialect, but there are so many more languages, and I think languages can only merge together and create a new language. So I think there will probably be more languages.
That's interesting because I've actually also heard the other thing, with like mass media and the internet and things like that. And then as people move away from their hometowns into
Yeah.
bigger cities and other countries, that you actually see a lot of languages disappearing also.
True, I think that that might be the case for smaller communities, because I think you have dying languages, and I think probably on the African continent that's happening a lot, that you have very few native speakers of certain dialects or languages. But I think in place of those dying languages, new languages will probably appear as well.
Hmm. That's it's kind of fascinating to think about. It's like evolution of languages as people come in contact with each other, you sort of like have them produce new languages, like you're saying, but then you have kind of like these.
Well, it's the same thing like with slang, and I'm not really familiar with, for example, American slang or well, city bound slang. But here in the Netherlands, like every corner of the Netherlands has its own dialect. Like every 12 kilometers, you have a different dialect and different vocabulary, and the bigger cities have different types of slang. But there's even certain grammar rules to those slang languages. So I can imagine that at one point they might evolve to a separate language. And I mean, how many conditions do you have to meet to be able to be a language, you know? So I think if you have grammar, if you have vocabulary, you have speakers, you already have a type of language.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, it might be a lot of PhD papers just waiting to be made.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how far in the future, but I was kind of wanting to get your thoughts. Have you ever heard about Jeff Bezos talk about why he created a space company, Blue Origin?
No, I can't say I haven't heard his personal talks about this.
Okay, so he talks about trying to create the infrastructure that allows for humanity to move all the earth harming activities that it does, like the mining, heavy industry, energy production, off
Mhm.
of the earth into space. And he would like to see Earth as like zoned to just be for life and not for these industrial activities.
Mhm.
Um, and I was wondering what you thought of that vision.
Well, I'm not really familiar with Jeff Bezos's vision specifically, but in general, these are subjects that do come up within space law, especially, for example, space mining. When you explain to people what space mining is, the first instinct is always to be against it, like, oh, we screwed up Earth and now we're gonna move it up into space, and the consequences are like of a super great level. But there are also good things because we're running out of fossil fuels here on Earth, and space is filled with them. So it's not really a bad idea to move these activities into space, because if you can mine for fuels and valuables in space, you can also produce in space. So you don't have to take like all these products and things from Earth into space, but it would also mean that we can get gas from space and extend our space voyages and learn more about the universe. So I think it's not an inherently bad idea. It just needs to be regulated very well. So it doesn't, create these geopolitical tensions and between peoples and governments. But I think that the idea, the general vision of it is not a bad vision.
And then, Elon Musk, he has a slightly different vision of creating a million person colony on Mars by 2050. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Um, the same thing, actually. It's not a super bad idea. I'm not sure if you can do it by 2050, honestly. But it just needs to be regulated. Like if space becomes accessible for humankind and not just for the very few, but you can um a la George Jetson launch your shuttles from your backyards and go into space as an independent private person, for example. Space becomes accessible to that point. I think it's only natural that we as humankind expand our territory, but at the same time, we should respect what is there. I think there's a kind of an arrogancy to how humankind behaves in space, we don't know if we're the only ones. I'm not saying that I believe in aliens or anything, but at the same time, I can't exclude there might be a possibility that there are other forms of life out there. And if even if there aren't, it's still nature. It's still, a planet that we should respect. So I think it's only natural if we have that accessibility that we would expand our territory as humankind. At the same time, it should be regulated.
And how do you see the regulation coming about? I guess this goes to the heart of maybe, oh, let me ask you one other question before hopping into that. If you could
Yeah,
take a
yeah.
trip to space, would you?
Not sure. Maybe if it does become that accessible within my lifetime, then I would feel uh more secure that I'll be able to come back to Earth in a safe manner. But I'm not so much inclined to go to space.
Um, okay, so I guess coming back to the regulation thing, I guess the way that it's currently sort of regulated now is based upon international treaty and international agreements, and this is really more of a voluntary type thing. Like it's more like how people conduct themselves in the ocean or in airspaces outside of, not over the land of countries and things like this. And of course, your research in the Artemis Accords, which is, the US's attempts to kind of um, maybe better defined and in some ways change what those rules are. And
Yeah.
I know you have some thoughts, both good and bad, about the
Yeah.
Artemis Accords. I was wondering if you could share them with me.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the space treaties. They're quite good. They have good provisions, but they're also quite vague. And they were created during the Cold War. And these tensions, the geopolitical tensions, are very much visible in the choice of words and how things are formulated in these provisions, which leads to, for example, we have Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which contains a non-appropriation principle. So basically says you can't lay claim on anything in space. Sure, but when you start commercial activities like mining, you're practically claiming a bit of space within space. You're claiming a certain territory because you're not going to move over if someone else is coming there and saying, I want to mine on that little piece of moonland. So on one hand, it's a good principle. On the other hand, it's so vaguely formulated that with current activities and the prospect of what we want to do, it doesn't really give us enough handles to to conduct certain space behavior in line with what was the thought of those treaties. And the good thing about the Artemis Accords is that they're non-binding political agreements between different parties at NASA. So you don't have something that's legally binding, and it's more to try to push these parties towards certain behavior that harmonizes their actions, which can only be good. But eventually they can become legally binding through customary law. I'm not sure if you are familiar with customary law or how it is created, but
No,
it's
what's
created.
customary law?
Customary law is unwritten law, so
Oh, is
non-codified
it
law.
like common law?
No, not sure, not really. It's more like if we've done something for the past 50 years and everybody agrees and practices the same practice, and shares an opinion that that's the right practice, that's the right way to behave, then we can rely on it as if it's codified law. And this is a principle within international law, so it is binding. You have to prove that it's binding through proving that there is practice and that there's this shared opinion. But this is how the Artemis Accords can eventually can eventually have binding provisions because if and because they have a growing number right now, more and more parties are signing it, eventually agreeing to that certain behavior and trying to exercise the behavior. So there is a practice forming at one point, and the fact that they signed it is that shared opinion, and then eventually you can prove that the Artemis Accords contain customary law. Um, and I think that's on one hand, it's a good thing. And on the other hand, we also have a lot of countries that don't have space programs, and they're absolutely not in a position to participate in these activities. So there might right now there might be a precedent being formed for certain space behavior, and that might become customary law. And then at one point, these countries that are currently not in a position to join want to join, but they can't do anything against that formed law, and even if they don't agree with it. So that's why I'm a bit, divided between the Artemis Accords are a good idea, but at the same time, do they really represent everyone's interest? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Trying to figure out China versus the United States is a very different question than trying to decide current space powers versus future space powers. I mean, one day maybe Brazil and Egypt or um, you know, uh,
Somalia.
yeah, I mean, at some day they might have spacecraft also, and I, I mean, it's kind of funny to think about, but whenever you look at what was it, like the Netherlands, for example, I mean, they had a shipping fleet. I mean, they were a pretty big empire around the world at one point, and it's like a
Yeah,
little bitty place in Europe. And
yeah,
then the UK also, it's like a little island, but at one point, it also had interest all around the world.
yeah.
So, I mean, you could see a little country maybe, having like dozens of settlements all throughout
Well,
the.
have you
So
heard of the claim on the geostationary orbit?
no, I
Are,
haven't. So are they like claiming the ones that are directly above their land or something like that?
Yeah, so that was in the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken. A few countries signed the Bogota Declaration, and
Hmm.
these were, well, I don't want to call it that, but for lack of better word, like third world countries that were not able to participate in space activities. And they said we recognize, the space treaties, but because of the geostationary orbit, if there are valuable asteroids floating above us and they're in the GSO, we want to claim them as our territory, basically to secure the point in time where they will be able to go to these asteroids. And they were laughed at, of course, because the GSO is like at 35,000 kilometers roughly from Earth. But then I read something about how people were laughing at the law of the sea and these 200 nautical miles of the exclusive economic zone. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Like we used to laugh at how can you maintain 200 nautical miles? Like you don't have the means to do that. And by now, like we do have them. So in the future, you might have the means to maintain the GSO. And that the first idea of claiming the GSO is not so weird anymore by these third world countries or less developed countries, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, especially considering it could be always above their territory, and it doesn't require any continuous energy input to keep things there. So
Exactly.
it's like,
Exactly. It's just the question of maintenance. Like right now, they wouldn't be able to maintain it. But for the rest, yeah, it's floating above there. So it's more a question of are we going to respect that as an international community, yes or no? So yeah.
yeah, and it's kind of interesting because there's no geostationary orbit above the United States, yet we're a huge user of it. So
Yeah.
that would be really require a lot of changes in the way we do
Yeah,
things.
but that's what I mean. Like it's law, like if the Artemis Accords, the provisions of the Artemis Accords at one point in time turn into type of customary law, it will not reflect everyone's interest. And that's kind of what the aim of the treaties are, to reflect the interest of as much involved states as possible. And I think the way the Artemis Accords are set up right now, it's a good initiative because it gets the discussion going. But at the same time, it doesn't really represent everyone yet.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting situation as well. I mean, how do you approach the point that these countries are like, hey, we're making the investment, we're taking the risk. We should have a little bit more say in what happens because we're doing it, and other countries who aren't in a position or have no intention of doing anything trying to put constraints on those countries. I mean, it seems like that also isn't precisely a good situation either.
I don't think you should view it as constraints. I think you should view it as a balance. Because that's a bit of the issue with commercial activities right now. These space treaties are very much set up with the idea that states are space actors and space activities are conducted with military or scientific purposes in mind. And there's this really big shift of private actors being involved right now for commercial purposes. And of course, if you have commercial purposes, you take a risk, you invest, and you want to get that investment back, and preferably with profit, because otherwise, why would you be doing it? So I acknowledge that, that's a good reason why those actors should have more say in it. But at the same time, you also restrict others from joining the field later on when it's already established. And is that completely fair? I don't think so.
Hmm. Well, I guess from a practical purpose, if we just, the GSO, that's one thing that
Mhm.
you kind of have sorted out by let's see, uh, geography and physics kind of help provide some guidance there.
Yeah.
Though implementing at this point would be extremely difficult. But I just looking at the moon and lunar real estate,
Yeah.
how would how would you kind of preserve a space for um, countries that don't have a space program now to participate later? I mean, like, how would the mechanics of it look like to you? What would you think would be a workable solution?
That's a really, really tough question. And I think you could also write a few PhDs on that, as long as nothing is being happening yet. But I think what you would want to prevent is that there is going to be a certain type of behavior rules and law established that by its nature excludes people who were not involved in the making of it. And I think when conducting space activities, thinking about regulations, that's a good thing to keep in mind. Like anyone can join at any time, any point of time, and participate just like the original participators are already there. I'm not sure how you would construct that in a way that sort of foresees everything that might happen in the future. I think that's impossible, but it should be changes should be allowed to be made to certain practices and certain regulations and rules that sort of secures that no one is being excluded with good intentions, of course, because people with bad intentions should be excluded. But but like people or actors that want to conduct space activities with good purposes in mind should be able to participate. And I think that's a really tough one to solve.
Uh, you mentioned you think people with bad purposes should be excluded. Uh, how do we determine if a purpose is bad or not?
Well, I've written a thesis about this. um, but basically, you have three pillars in space law. Because space law is about the practice of space activities, but space activities usually don't really concern themselves with the laws that regulate them. So I get to say a lot about space activities without, having the practice actually there. But there are three pillars in space law about space activities, and that should be that there's freedom for everyone in space, freedom of access, use, and exploration. And there should be international cooperation, so there is no little individual islands. We should always stay in discussion with each other about what we're going to do. And the third one is that we should conduct every space activity with peaceful purposes in mind. And peaceful purposes, again, is also a very vague concept. It's very much dependent on other concepts like the principle of good faith. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it, but just like with your best intentions, you conduct something. And I think it eventually comes down to the intent of the actor and the purpose of the activity. So if you have, for example, currently you can't place nuclear weapons on the moon. But the space treaties don't say anything about conventional weapons. And a conventional weapon, for example, if you have dynamite, you can use it to blow up someone's camp, or you can use it to blow up a rock and continue mining and use that mining product for good purposes. So the intent of the actor here, like, do you want to do something peaceful or no, is very much important, and the purpose of the activity. It's I think that are two very big things that you can decide on whether or not someone has good intentions or not.
Hmm. Yeah, I
So
guess
even
also how transparent they are is a big key
yeah,
part of it. Are they
yeah, and then
actually?
you come back to that international cooperation pillar, that if you are very secretive about what you're doing, and you're making use of weapons or dangerous goods or whatever, then your intention is probably not as good as it would be when you're very much transparent and stay in an open discussion about what you're going to do and where you're going to do it.
I feel like you and I probably could talk all day.
I think so, probably. Yeah.
Um, but I know we covered a lot of topics, but is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
Um, well, of course, yes, a lot. But to state it in 1 minute, I think space and space law is so far from, the regular person's mind, that they don't realize that we're actually in space. Like, Earth is actually part of space. A lot of people forget that until you point them at the cell phone in their pocket, or like the radio that they listen to. Like, this is making use of space. And I think it would be great if people would become more aware of space and space activities, and then get to those questions that interest me, like these ethical things. Like, it's how do we want to behave as humans, like in space but also on Earth. And I think it would be great if people would think about that a lot more.
I've thought about how to get people to think about that a lot more and who should be thinking about that. I have an idea for you. What do you think about whenever space travel becomes relatively common, that we actually move the United Nations from New York to an orbiting facility, and then you have all these delegates that have like they can see like the Earth rotating below them, or them going around the Earth rather. I was just wondering what
Hmm.
you thought about that.
About that vision.
Uh-huh.
I think it would be interesting, but I've also been thinking, if we were able to put permanent settlements on the moon or Mars, and well, currently you can't, as I spoke about earlier, you can't claim anything in space, the non-appropriation principle. But what if at some point we agree that you can create a state, and you would have a state on Mars, for example? What would be the point of the United Nations? Should it be like the United Planetaries or something
Yeah,
like that,
yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's really, it puts the function of the United Nations in perspective again, and that we should think about it. And I think if we're not able to yet, but we are able to put like a rotating spaceship in orbit with the members of the United Nations in it, the representatives, I think it would act maybe as kind of a confronting mirror. Like, all these decisions that you're making are actually being made about this little blue ball that you're looking at right now. So,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, back to your point of thinking of space as something different than our daily existence, not realizing that you're actually in space. It's like, I mean, I look at the International Space Station and see like the Earth views and things, and those astronauts are continuously
looking at it, yeah,
reminded that
yeah,
the Earth is, you know, just this little ball that's lucky enough to have enough atmosphere around it to allow for us to survive.
yeah, yeah. I think it's kind of like not how to say that in English properly, but kind of like a cold shower feeling, like, oh,
Ah, yes.
we're just like this in this whole world that we haven't even explored yet. Um, but everything we do have consequences. And I think that's kind of also the gist of space law. It's at this point in time, it's kind of thinking of what do we want our behavior to be, because it's kind of our last time to do it right as humankind for the foreseeable future. So,
Yeah. everything we do have consequences, but the things we don't do also has consequences.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and
Yeah,
thank you so much for participating in my project. I hope people 200 years from now can look back on this video and get a better sense of like the issues that we were having to deal with that
yeah.
created their world.
Exactly. That would be so weird. It would be nice if we could forward in time to see what that looks like and come back and be like, oh, okay, so what I do now is gotta be good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you have a good day and
You
take care.
too. Yeah.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.